Okay, so what I'm showing here is the outside of the wall assembly with the beam coming through. This material, this kind of white material here, this is the blocket, so I'm showing this with the siding removed. And the next thing I wanted to point out here is just that there is currently a cavity that the beam passes through. So there's a layer of OSB, some spacer framing, then another layer of OSB. And I'm pointing that out just because I believe the best way to go about sealing this opening tightly is going to be to remove a portion of that inner layer of OSB. So in this slide, you can see where I've cut out part of that OSB to expose the first layer of OSB on the exterior, and then obviously you'll also be able to see the spacer framing that exists in there. So the next step, I believe, should be to take treated lumber. I believe it would be pretty easy to get a 2x4 in there. Go ahead and block off the opening as tightly as possible to give a nice tight seams for the fluid applied flashing to adhere to. The next step would then be to remove the blocket, and the fast flash needs at least 6 inches of OSB to adhere to. It can also be adhered to the blocket, but in my experience with using the product, I think that'd be really, really difficult. The stuff spreads kind of like a firm peanut butter, and it seems like it'd be easier to apply it to a hard substrate versus a fabric. So I think it makes sense to cut that back about 10 inches all the way around and then just apply a new piece of WRB over the top when everything is done. So this next slide, it shows that WRB pulled off. It obviously doesn't need to be pulled off in a full sheet like that. That was just for simplicity's sake. The next product that's applied is going to be the Proseco joint and seam filler, which is kind of a pink substance, and it just needs to get into all of the seams and joints in the wood and the structure there. It's best to kind of tool it out onto the beam a little bit and bring it out onto the OSB just to give it a little more substrate to adhere to. Personally, I would bring it out maybe an inch or two onto the OSB, just because OSB is not the most sound substrate in the world. So then once that's cured, the next step would be to apply the Proseco Fast Flash. And as I think I mentioned earlier, Fast Flash needs to come out 6 inches, minimum of 6 inches. So along the OSB, it should cover the OSB 6 inches out in all directions, and then also along the beam 6 inches out in all directions. And unlike traditional flashing that needs to go on in a shingle-like manner, I mean, obviously everything above this and around this should be shingle-like, but with the beam, you can just go ahead and put it on in one monolithic layer, so it just covers everything at the same time. And after that has cured, the next step would be to go ahead and flash the top of the beam to prevent any water from getting into the beam. So probably worth noting, because the beam was made up of 3 pieces of lumber and doesn't have flashing on top, basically what was created was a shelf for bulk water. So anytime there's going to be ice or anything dripping down on top of that, it's going to get down into the beam. So I would suspect that moisture infiltration through this beam would get worse over time, just due to freeze thaw, shrinkage of the wood, things like that. So the top of the beam really needs to be flashed, and I think that's especially true given the fact that the mechanical code requires either a fan providing negative pressure or an HRV or an ERV system that would provide obviously more balanced pressure but constant ventilation. But it does sound as though this structure is going to be under negative pressure, so it's good to get flashing on top of this beam. And so again, that would be done using drip edge, and so 2 drip edges should be pretty easy to get at any building supply center, and then On top of those could go a piece of flashing tape, something like Vicor, or even like an ice and water shield sort of product, which personally I would turn that up at the end just to provide an additional layer of weather protection at that joint there. Then the next step would just be to restore the WRB, the blocket, and then after that the siding could be restored.